Shiori Ino filed her first police report in the summer of 1999. She was 21 years old, a university student in Saitama Prefecture, and she was being stalked by a man she had stopped dating. She didn't file once and give up. She and her family went back to the police again and again, over 4 months, with written documentation of harassment. Defamatory flyers spread through her neighborhood, threatening letters sent to her family and her university, evidence that her life was in danger. 4 months. She tried for 4 months to get the system to protect her. On October 26, 1999, Shiori Ino walked into JR Okegawa Station and was stabbed in the chest by a hired killer. She bled to death on the way to hospital. She was 21 years old. She had done everything right. This is the Okegawa Stalker murder. Okegawa sits north of Tokyo on the Takasaki line, a quiet commuter suburb the size of a long breath between stations. It was not a place associated with premeditated killing, which is part of why what happened there on the afternoon of October 26, 1999, a Tuesday, landed with such force when the full story emerged. Shiori Ino was approaching the entrance to JR Okegawa Station when a man stepped in front of her. His name was Yoshifumi Kubota. He did not know her. She did not know him. He stabbed her in the chest. Emergency services came, but Ino died of her wounds before she could be saved. She was a third-year university student. She was 21 years old. The investigation moved quickly. Within days it became clear that the attack had not been random and had not been the work of a disturbed stranger acting on impulse. Kubota had been hired. The man who had arranged to have Shiori Ino killed was named Kazuhito Komatsu, a 27-year-old she had dated briefly earlier that year. When she tried to end the relationship, he had refused to let it end. What followed was months of escalating threats and organized harassment, involving Komatsu, his older brother, and a circle of associates. And what had allowed that escalation to reach murder was a fact that emerged in the days and weeks after the killing, and that ultimately shook the country's faith in its own police. The Ino family had told the police everything months in advance. They had brought documentation, they had begged for help, and the police had turned them away, and then, it seems, had covered their tracks. The case became bigger than a murder. It became a reckoning about the failure of institutions to protect the living, and a question of what justice owed to someone who had done everything she was supposed to do. Shiori Ino met Kazuhito Komatsu at a game center in early 1999. He introduced himself with a different name, not his own. He also misrepresented his age, claiming to be 3 years younger than he was, and told her he worked as a foreign car dealer. By the time Ino recognized the shape of these deceptions, they had already been seeing each other for a while, and by then Komatsu had started making himself very difficult to leave. When she ended things, he refused to accept it, and his response was not grief. It was organized, deliberate, and escalating. Over the months that followed, Komatsu and his associates ran what can only be described as a coordinated harassment campaign. Defamatory flyers containing explicit, false sexual slanders about Ino were printed and distributed through her neighborhood. Letters went out to her family, her friends, and her university. Threatening phone calls came to her home. The goal appeared to be systematic destruction, to humiliate her, to isolate her, to make her feel that nowhere was safe, and to pressure her back into the relationship she had chosen to leave. Ino and her family responded through the proper channels. They went to the Agio police station, which held jurisdiction over the area, beginning in the summer of 1999. They did not go once. They went repeatedly, bringing documentation, the flyers, the correspondence, the records of the threatening calls. According to investigators who later reviewed the case file, the evidence of criminal harassment was not ambiguous. There is one detail in particular that has to be named plainly. At some point before Ino's death, a warning reached police that a murder plot against her was being organized. That warning existed in the system. The police did not arrest Komatsu. It emerged after Ino's murder that officers at the Agio station had failed to properly process the complaints filed by the Ino family. Some records had been falsified, others had simply not been registered. Whether this was systemic indifference, individual misconduct, or something worse would be argued in courts and inquiry rooms for years. The officers responsible would eventually be convicted. but only after Shiori Ino was already dead. Kubota was arrested in December 1999, roughly 6 weeks after the killing, and admitted to the stabbing. Investigators traced the arrangement of the murder to Kazuhito Komatsu and to his older brother Takeshi Komatsu, who had taken on the role of organizing the actual contract. Kazuhito Komatsu did not wait for arrest. When he learned a warrant was being issued for him, he fled, first to Hokkaido, then further. He was found dead in January 2000, having taken his own life. He never stood before a judge. The question of why is, in this case, inseparable from the question of how a man's refusal to accept a woman's decision to leave was allowed to become lethal. Komatsu had established control from the beginning. He chose what name she would know him by. He chose what she would believe about his age and his occupation. These are not accidents or convenient lies. They are the earliest evidence of a person who understood the relationship as something to be managed and controlled rather than entered into honestly. When Ino removed herself from his control, the campaign he launched was not the outburst of someone overwhelmed by emotion. It required planning, money, printing, coordination, and sustained effort across months. The defamatory flyers had to be designed and produced. The letters had to be written and sent. Associates had to be recruited and paid. This was not grief expressed badly. This was punishment administered deliberately. And when that campaign failed to break her or bring her back, the next step was to have her killed. Investigators and commentators who examined the case pointed carefully, and without claiming to offer a formal clinical diagnosis of Komatsu specifically, to a pattern recognized in the most dangerous stalking cases. At this extreme end of the spectrum, what drives the behavior is not love, but a need for dominance. Rejection is not felt as loss. It is felt as an intolerable insult to the self, and the danger in these cases is that the stalker's distress does not diminish as time passes, it intensifies. The escalation from harassment to violence follows a twisted internal logic. If social destruction fails to restore control, then physical destruction becomes the next step. The involvement of his older brother complicates the picture further. Takeshi Komatsu was not a heartbroken man acting out of obsession. He organized a murder. That makes him not a bystander dragged into a private crisis, but a participant who made a deliberate choice. Whatever dynamic existed in that family, whatever the relationship was between the brothers, it produced an environment in which Shiori Ino was treated not as a person with the right to leave, but as a problem to be eliminated. But the answer the public came to focus on was broader than the Komatsu family. The system that could have intervened had been given every opportunity to do so, 4 months' worth of opportunities, and it failed. What follows is an interpretive framework based on the documented pattern of the perpetrator's behavior and on general research into obsessive stalking. It is not a clinical diagnosis of any individual. At the most dangerous end of the stalking spectrum, the people involved are often not in acute psychiatric crisis. They are not acting out of chaos or uncontrolled impulse. They tend to be methodical. They plan. They sustain their campaigns over weeks or months. They recruit others. What drives them is typically not an overwhelming feeling they cannot help but a sense of entitlement they feel completely justified in pursuing. The harm they cause is not incidental, it is the point. The pattern visible in this case fits that profile. Komatsu organized systematic defamation. He recruited his brother and others. He ultimately paid for a killing. Nothing about that sequence is impulsive or uncontrolled. It is the behavior of someone who decided that his claim on Ino's future overrode her right to live it. The institutional failure is, in its own way, a mirror image of that psychology. The officers who received the Ino family's complaints and either failed to act or actively suppressed the records were operating within a broader culture. One documented in many countries, not only Japan, in which stalking by a former romantic partner tends to be classified as a private matter rather than a criminal one. The implicit assumption is that a past relationship creates some standing, some continued claim that transforms threatening behavior into something less than a crime. It doesn't. It never did. But that assumption has proven lethal in case after case. In this instance, Police had been told explicitly, before October 26th, that Shiori Ino's life was being threatened. That information existed in the system. The failure to act on it was not an absence of knowledge. It was a decision, somewhere in the chain, by someone, that her life was not worth the disruption of a real investigation. The media's role in the immediate aftermath deserves its own accounting. In the days after the murder, Saitama Prefectural Police fed tabloids a portrait of Ino as promiscuous and materialistic. Stories ran suggesting she had worked as an escort. These were false. The mainstream press, following the tabloids, amplified them. It took an investigative reporter named Kiyoshi Shimizu, then working for Focus magazine, one of Japan's major weekly photo news publications, to go back to the beginning, to sit with Ino's family, to look at the actual documentary evidence, and to reconstruct the truth. What one journalist accomplished in a few weeks, identifying the real story, the real perpetrators, and the real institutional failure, was what months of police work had refused to do. His reporting forced the case open. The arrests followed. He won awards for his reporting in 2001 and later published a book about the case under Shinchosha that became essential reading on police accountability and press manipulation in Japan. The gap between what the police told the public and what was true is not a footnote. It is part of the crime. Justice followed, in pieces and imperfectly. Takeshi Komatsu, the older brother who organized the murder, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Japan's Supreme Court upheld that sentence on appeal in December 2005. Yoshifumi Kubota, the hitman, received 18 years in prison. Two other accomplices each received 15 years. Kazuhito Komatsu, the man who had started the campaign that ended in Ino's death, never stood in a courtroom. He died by his own hand in January 2000. The police were not exempted. 3 officers from the Agio police station, Toshio Katagiri, Hirokazu Furuta, and Tsuyoshi Honda, were convicted of falsifying documents related to the Ino family's complaints. Other officers were disciplined and dismissed. Superior officers had their salaries docked. The head of the relevant investigation unit was demoted. The Saitama Prefectural Police was ordered by a court to pay damages to Ino's family for its dereliction of duty. And in November 2000, Japan passed its first national anti-stalking law, the Stalker Regulation Law, Act No. 81 of 2000. The law prohibits stalking and pursuit behavior, grants police the authority to issue warnings and prohibition orders, and establishes criminal penalties for those who continue. It was driven directly by the public outrage the Okegawa case had ignited. Japan had no such law when Shiori Ino was reporting her harassment month after month. After she was killed, it became impossible to argue one wasn't needed. Shiori Ino was 21 years old. She reported the threats, she documented the harassment, she filed her complaints, brought her evidence, and went back to the police again and again. She did everything she was supposed to do. The system had everything it needed to protect her and chose not to use it. What the law now says, partly because of what happened to her, is that choosing not to use it is no longer an option. That's a small inheritance. But it belongs to her. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the cases that changed Japan, because understanding how the law fails and how it's forced to change is just as important as understanding the crimes themselves.